Hello and welcome to another CPD talk. My name's Jasmine. I'm a senior biomedical scientist and the training lead for North Kent Pathology Service. Today we're going to be talking about introductory qualifications, specifically the Certificate of Achievement Parts 1 and 2. So what we're going to cover today is what the Certificate of Achievement is, who's eligible to complete this, what the purpose of the qualification is, what sections are in the Certificate of Achievement, and how the assessment of the Certificate of Achievement works. So what is the Certificate of Achievement? The Certificate of Achievement is an IBMS qualification for healthcare science support workers, or those who are interested in becoming one. It's designed to reflect both the employer's and the individual's training needs. The qualification comes in two parts, Part 1 and Part 2, and both are portfolio-based, so similarly to registration and specialist, they involve a portfolio. The portfolio itself guides and assesses the development of skills that underpin the biomedical science workforce. They enable you, the candidate, to demonstrate your knowledge and skills and evidence your laboratory training. They're very flexible qualifications and can be used in a range of biomedical science disciplines. So they are very generalised. You don't do one in, say, for example, if you were to complete it while you're in blood transfusion, that doesn't mean that you're stuck in blood transfusion. They have a wide array of skills involved in them. And as much as we're talking about this from a biomedical science point of view, they're not just of use in pathology laboratories. They're very useful in all laboratories. So who's eligible for the Certificate of Achievement? For the Part 1 of this qualification, there isn't really any eligibility criteria. The only thing is that you will need the support of your laboratory, and your laboratory must have an IBMS biomedical support staff training approval. Either your training officer will be aware of this, or I think there's a way you can look this up online as well. For Part 2, however, you have to be an associate of the IBMS. So you can become an associate by completing Part 1. As well as this, you should have relevant laboratory experience and hold a Level 3 qualification relating to biological science, or, as I previously said, have completed the Certificate of Achievement Part 1. So Part 1 is very open to everyone. Part 2, technically you could skip Part 1 and go straight into Part 2 if you have previous qualifications. However, quite often people do Part 1 and then move on to Part 2. What is the purpose of this qualification? The Part 1 of the qualification enables you to demonstrate the level of knowledge and skills expected of a Band 2 or Band 3 biomedical science support worker, whereas the Part 2 enables you to demonstrate the level of knowledge and skills expected of a Band 4 science support worker. So by having these qualifications, it can help you to move up the ladder within your laboratory. And obviously it looks good if you are interviewing for a position that you've already got this qualification in place. We're now just going to go through what is actually involved in the portfolios and how they work. So they're structured around specific modules of described knowledge, competence and evidence. So this basically means there are several modules in the portfolio, and in each of those modules it will have certain competencies that it wants you to meet, and then you provide evidence to that. So again, it's very similar to the registration portfolio, but there is a small difference to that, and we'll come to that in a moment. These portfolios have a set number of core modules, and then there are several optional modules, of which a minimum number need to be completed on top of the core modules. The optional modules can be chosen to reflect your own duties and the type of service your laboratory provides. If we have a look, this is the modules involved in Part 1. So in both of the portfolios, they're split up between professional roles, health and safety, quality, specimen handling, and performing standard tests. And then, as I said before, you've got core and optional modules. So if we have a look in professional roles, all of the modules are core modules and you have to complete all of them. Whereas in health and safety, you've got one that's an optional module. So you can choose to complete it, or you could choose to complete something else. So you can see that there are 12 core modules in total and 8 optional modules. And from this, you can kind of see the type of work that you would be doing. If we move on to part 2, this actually goes across 2 different slides. Core modules, they are going to be very similar. So if you have a look, core modules are pretty much the same. There is now a core performing standard tests module and a extra specimen handling module, but otherwise they are the same. If we're then to look at the optional module, there's now an optional professional roles module, and there are a lot more optional modules in the performing standard tests. So you can kind of see that there's a difference. Now, as you can see, between part 1 and part 2, a lot of the modules are similar, as I said before, and some of them look exactly the same. However, when you then go into that module, you wouldn't be providing the same evidence. So I'm going to go through that now. One of my colleagues at work has completed both part 1 and part 2, and she has agreed to share this with us so we can have a look at it and see how she's completed one of the specific sections. So I've gone for section 1, the professional roles, and module 4, data handling. So on the left hand side of your screen, you've got part 1, and on the right hand side of your screen you've got part 2. So at the beginning of each section you will have knowledge and competence of what you need to be able to do. And so if we have a look at part 1, the knowledge says recognise how information governance relates to your own scope of practice, know the local guidelines and procedures for handling and recording laboratory data, be aware of a range of terminology used in relation to specimen test requests, and understand the need to maintain accurate data. We then look at part 2. It's very similar, there's just a few small changes. So you've got know how information governance relates to own scope of practice within the job role. So one of them is to recognise, you know that you understand that it's a part of your scope of practice, and then in part 2 you have to know it, you have to really understand it and have that depth of knowledge. The next one in part 2 is the same as in part 1, and again the third one, it's more you have to know the terminology as opposed to just being aware of the terminology. So they are very similar, but in part 1 it's a bit more overarching, a bit more general, and you don't have to have the same depth of knowledge as you do in part 2. If you then go down to the competence, you can see that there's quite a few differences here. So in part 1 it says summarise key aspects of data handling, correctly input and retrieve data from the laboratory information system, demonstrate compliance in respect to confidentiality in accordance with local procedures, and apply knowledge of terminology, medical, biological, scientific, technical, in relation to data entry for laboratory tests. If we compare that to part 2, you've got correctly input and retrieve data from laboratory information systems, demonstrate compliance in respect to confidentiality in accordance with local procedures, apply knowledge of terminology, medical, biological, scientific, technical, in relation to data entry for laboratory test requests, train and supervise others to ensure that the correct procedures for handling information are followed, and contribute positively to the review of data handling procedures. So there are 2 extra competences that are different in comparison to part 1. If we then move on to looking at what you've got to complete within this section or module, each module will have an evidence of achievement section where the trainee and the trainer has to sign off their information to say that yes, they understand this and yes, they are doing this in their everyday work and job role. You start completing the certificate of achievement, you should have a mentor in place who will help to sign this off. They don't have to be someone senior in the lab, they just have to be someone that works in your department or with you and can help you through it. So the first part, as I said, is signing off that the staff member understands and is able to do the first few tasks. Then at the end it says has completed evidence 1, 2, 3. When it says that, this is where it differs more to the registration portfolio. If you've watched that video, is the evidences in these sections, it asks you for a specific evidence, whereas obviously in the registration portfolio you can choose what evidence you want to use. So if we have a look at the evidence, this section. So for part 1, evidence 1 is complete the table below, identify 4 examples of confidential data found in the department and indicate where they are located, what their purpose is and who has access to them. And there's a little light bulb, it's like a hint, and says you probably deal with confidential data on a daily basis. Think back to what forms of data you had dealt with. And then there is this table that has to be filled out by the staff member completing the qualification, and their mentor will have a look through and sign it off. In part 2, the first evidence is summarise the purpose of information governance and consequences of not following the requirements of it. So this is where there's that difference between be aware of information governance and know about information governance. Here it's sort of saying, in the table you're saying, yes, I know that this and this are really important for information governance and we have this in place to stop people from getting to it. Whereas in the part 2, you're actually looking at the consequences of not following these rules and requirements. Here, I mean, if you want to pause the video and have a look at what the staff member has written, then please feel free. As we move forward, I'm just going to compare the different evidences that they have asked for in the different portfolios instead of looking at the answers that have been given by this member of staff. So the first 2 here are from part 1, and then the second 2 on the screen are from part 2. So if we have a look at the part 1, evidence 2, the question is, a friend asks you to look up a result of a laboratory test and comment on the accuracy of the information. Record how you responded to the request. What did you learn? How will this affect your future handling of a similar situation? In part 2, evidence 2 is list the checks you would make when training an inexperienced member of staff in the procedure for data entry. Think of basic training principles and when you were trained, how did you check understanding? What documentation did you complete? Then evidence 3 for part 1 is list 10 terms and abbreviations that are commonly used in your work and define each one. Provide an example to illustrate their use. Evidence 3 for part 2 is list 10 terms and abbreviations that are commonly used in your scope of practice and define each one. Provide an example of when each of you used in your workplace. And then finally, in the Certificate of Achievement Part 2, there are actually 4 evidences required instead of 3, and it says you've been asked to help with a review of data handling procedures, think about your role and summarise some key areas, the areas you could contribute to. It may be helpful to conduct a mini review of your data handling process. What would you identify? So having a look at those different evidences, you can kind of see how they fit into the knowledge and competence required at the beginning of that section of the portfolio. And hopefully you can see the difference between doing part 1 and part 2, and how one is sort of looking at how you perform in the lab on your own, and the other one is looking more at how you perform as a team in the lab. Finally, at the end of each section, your line manager needs to put a little comment, and it's sort of just an overview of that section and how that staff member upholds the principles of that section. So you can see here this staff member was signed off by 2 different people for part 1 and part 2. One of them was a senior, the other one was a BMS. And this is what I mean by it doesn't have to be a really senior member of staff to sign you off. It just needs to be someone that works with you regularly. So that's sort of the end of what I'm going to go through with the sections of the Certificate of Achievement. If you are interested more in seeing what's involved, they do have reference copies of this qualification on the IBMS website. So go and check that out, have a look. I think there is also a leaflet and a PowerPoint on there, which gives a very brief overview of the qualification. So how is this assessed? You'll be issued with the completed qualification once you have completed the portfolio. Each of the performance criteria in your portfolio has been signed off by your training officer or laboratory manager. You and your training officer or laboratory manager have completed and signed off the declaration at the back of the portfolio and submitted this to the IBMS office. Once completed, the Certificate of Achievement will be sent to the candidate's address within 2 weeks of the IBMS receiving the completed portfolio and signed declaration. The IBMS may audit portfolios to ensure standards are maintained. So basically, the majority of the work with this is going to be with your mentor, who will sit and sign you off and decide whether or not the evidence is enough or you understand it in the way that you're meant to. However, so the IBMS don't really look at the bulk of your portfolio, they're only going to look at the declaration at the end, but there is the chance it could be audited to ensure that the training lab and you have completed it properly and someone hasn't just signed you off at the end. Once you have been assessed with the Certificate of Achievement, you then have the option to be able to apply to the Science Council. So as well as completing Part 1, you can become an associate with the IBMS. You can also either become a registered science technician with Part 1 or a registered scientist with Part 2. It depends on what you're doing in the lab as to whether or not this will be of any interest to you. But if I just take you to their page quickly. So this is the Science Council's page. And you can go and have a look and see what that actually means to you and whether that's anything that you're actually interested in. There's a little YouTube talk on it as well, so I'm not going to spend very long on it, but it will be similar to the IBMS, where you'll get access to resources and other people that you can talk to within this area. So it's just an interesting thing to be aware of that you can do once you've passed that Certificate of Achievement. Whether or not you do it, that's completely up to you. So that's the Certificate of Achievement in a nutshell. It's a very good introductory portfolio in biomedical science and pathology. It evidences your laboratory experiences and allows you to potentially move from a band 2 to a band 4. And the other thing to ensure that you're aware of is that you will need your laboratory support to be able to complete this qualification, because you need at the very least someone to sit down and sign it off with you. In reality, you should have someone to help you out, because obviously the first couple of bits of evidence are going to be they're going to be harder for you to complete because you haven't done it before. Yes, I'd like to thank you all so much for listening. I've left the links to the IBMS website down below and the Science Council website as well. I'd also like to thank Jo for allowing me to share her work on here. If you do have any questions or you are interested in doing this, speak to your line manager, or you can come and find me to discuss it. We are trying to encourage people to do these qualifications within NKPS. Alright, thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Bye!